Hi, I'm Tim. I'm going to be talking a little bit about climate change and how it's affected specifically trout, and even more specifically brook trout, in the northern slopes of the Adirondacks region. First and foremost, temperature is almost the most deciding factor in trout mortality in the northern slopes of the Adirondacks. Trout mortality is pretty high for a variety of reasons, most of which are man-made. But when it comes to trout, and especially brook trout, the summer kill, what we call summer kill a lot of times, it gets too hot in the summer, a lot of trout die. It's pretty simple. It gets too hot, trout die, especially brook trout. Now, other introduced species of trout, like brown trout and rainbow trout, that are commonly stocked by the State Department of Environmental Conservation here in New York, they can stand thermal pollution and other kinds of pollutants a little bit better than brook trout. Generally speaking, as far as water temperature is concerned, optimum temperature for feeding activity for brook trout generally runs about 50 degrees, 5 degrees either side of that. So from about 45 to 50 degrees is optimal feeding temperature as far as the water is concerned. And that also means that the insect activity and the invertebrates that the fish eat on are also most active at those water temperatures. So it's not just important for the fish as far as their metabolism is concerned, it's also important for how much food is available to them and how fast they can grow, because they grow fastest in those water temperature ranges as well. So generally 45 to 55 degrees is optimum temperature for brook trout. The other brown trout and rainbow trout generally tends to be 55 to 65 degrees is optimum feeding temperature for those two trout. Now what happens when the river systems get too warm? A couple of things happen. First of all, the trout will seek the coldest, they'll seek thermal refuges. They'll swim upriver and downriver, and they can sense the springs coming in or wherever the water is colder, and they will bunch up, they will congregate there unnaturally. So when it starts to get really warm, they'll pile up like cordwood where a little cold spring might be coming in, or where a little cold brook runs into the main river or something like that. And because of that, they're much more susceptible to predation, not only by people fishing, but by their natural predators. Anything that eats them are going to find just a bunch of them all congregated, and they die really quickly that way. As far as how the heat directly kills trout, especially brook trout, it's when the water temperature reaches certain critical points during the day, the trout's metabolism will shut down. Now, when it's very cold, the metabolisms slow down, but on the hot side of things, the metabolism will actually shut down when it gets to a certain temperature. And that means that they won't feed, they won't really move much at all, they'll just kind of hunker down, and if it gets really hot enough, you could go out there as a person, reach around slowly around rocks and physically grab them and pick them up with your hand. That's how much their metabolism shuts down. It's a crazy thing to see and to witness. But really what will happen a lot of times is there's a big temperature swing from day to night, especially if it's a sunny day and there's no cover over a river system. Generally speaking, the river systems are homothermic for the most part. You've got moving water, so most of the river is the same temperature, unlike stratified lakes, and I'll talk a little bit about that a little bit later. But there's a lot of misconceptions out there among anglers especially. They'll say, oh, this fish was in this deep hole in the river because it was colder down at the bottom. Well, no. You're in a moving water system. It's constantly mixing. A hole that's 10 foot deep is no colder than it is, a foot down from the top if that water is moving. It's all constantly mixing. So no, that's one common misconception. So it's no colder down there than it is here, unless you have a spring coming in somewhere, a cold spring coming in, or unless again you have a little creek or a brook coming in that's spring fed, where there's a thermal refuge. So the big killer as far as in river systems, as far as one of the three big killers in the northern slopes of Adirondacks, is the heat during summer. Now that, even if it doesn't kill them, it certainly is a stressor where other factors can come into play, both natural and unnatural factors, and contribute to trout mortality. Factors such as acid precipitation, factors such as an unusual phenomenon for this geographic region called anchor ice, and some other factors. When you take all the factors into consideration, they all add. So if the heat rises a little bit, that's a stress factor on that trout, and the other factors contribute to that, and they can die easier that way. As far as ponds and lakes go, it's not my area of expertise really, but there's some common misconceptions there too. Generally speaking, again, deep water is not necessarily a thermal refuge unless it's stratified, unless there's a distinct thermal stratification, which comes with very specific criteria in nature. For a pond or a lake to stratify, first of all, it's not going to happen on 10, 15, 20 foot pond generally. You have to have a very deep body of water for it to actually stratify. And then, so just because you have some depth does not mean it can save, it does not mean it's a thermal refuge for the trout. Trying to think of what else I can. Oh, one of the other factors that can contribute to brook trout, especially, again, all trout, but especially brook trout mortality, is the warmer it gets, the later in the year they will spawn. Generally, and I've seen this personally, where if you go out after the regular fishing season ends, usually around, depends where you're at, October 15th or even before that in some areas in this area. Sometimes you can actually see the brook trout and other trout, but mostly brook trout that time of year, going into the little feeder creeks and actually spawning. They run out of the main bodies of water, whether they're ponds or lakes, and you can see them spawning. It's a wonderful thing to witness. But the water temperature and the conditions have to be just so before they do that. With the warmer temperatures, it forces them to spawn later, which changes the whole dynamic of how long the incubation period may be, and how many eggs end up hatching out in the end. If you have too short a period between the time that they spawn and the time that certain natural factors happen in the spring. What we have to keep in mind too is that the warmer water and the warmer temperatures don't just affect the trout directly, they also affect the trout indirectly, in that, again, back to the forage. Their forage are these aquatic invertebrates. Basically, three types of aquatic flies are, for a young trout's diet, the majority of it is made up of, in this area, again, in the rivers, stoneflies, mayflies, and caddisflies, those three groups of flies. they're dependent on cold, clean water as well. So anytime you have the system starts to warm, then you start to affect the populations of the fish's forage as well. So when you start warming water, you start affecting not just the trout directly, but the trout indirectly, and other things like their forage base, and not just the invertebrates, the vertebrates as well. Smaller fish, minnows that the larger trout would feed on, and even even the flora. You affect everything. You affect the type of plants that are there. You affect the types of algae. Everything. You affect the whole system, and these aren't big changes in temperature that it takes to change some of these things. Some of these changes can happen with just 2 or 3 degrees Celsius change in the average water temperature can have a huge impact on all these things. Those are the biggest points for.
So do you think climate change is the reason the water is warming? Is the water warming?
The water absolutely is warming. There's no doubt about that. I mean, you can see, you can find all kinds of, especially in the northern slopes of the Adirondacks. I mean, you can find all kinds of data on, the water temperature increases. It absolutely is warming. What was the original question? Is that the only reason?
No, is that, do you think climate change is causing that? I know it's not.
I see, yeah. Oh, climate change, yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a direct correlation and causation, I believe, between, the warming of the climate and the warming of the rivers and, the thermal effects that it has on the fish. I mean, that's pretty direct. That can, in certain circumstances, be exacerbated by other factors that will also warm the water up here. One of the biggest being dams. Anytime, and that's a real issue. Now, some of the power companies have tried to push renewable energy, such as hydropower, as green energy. It really isn't green energy, not at all. I've seen more ecological damage done by hydro dams than anything else up here in the northern slopes of the Adirondacks. They have decimated trout populations and really changed the ecosystems. So, but I have, I fish on and have done studies on rivers up here that have hydro plants on them and others that don't or have very few. So, and both are experiencing an increase in water temperatures and the detrimental effects of those. It's worse where you have dams. Anytime you dam a stream,
You're
still going?
Yeah.
Anytime you dam a stream, a few things happen. First of all, you slow the flow of the water. That in and of itself doesn't decrease the water temperature. However, sediment builds up behind that. The sediment gets dark, the water spreads out, gets shallower, and therefore heats up more. So you're making a bathtub anytime you do that. And there are a lot of other really bad issues that come with hydropower plants, especially on cold water systems. Not as many issues on warm water systems, but when we're talking about cold water systems like trout habitat, they can be very, very detrimental. But this is specifically about temperature, so I won't get into much of that. But temperature is the number one killer. Temperature rise is the number one killer of trout in these areas up in the northern slopes of the Adirondack.